Yeah, this is Action Figure UK tips, customs and reviews, and this is how to make your own custom bootleg S.H Figuarts Imperfect Cell. Okay, there's quite a lot to go through, so I'll just get a move on. But before I do, I just want to mention, I know there can be quite a lot of space in between my videos, but I don't exclusively just customize figures and what else you've seen on my channel before. I'm just a creative guy. I like making things, and I mean, as well as obviously ACBA and figure photography. I've built a Master Sword from Zelda. I like to draw. I like to paint displays for my figures, as well as do custom figures and build dios, and I quite like bonsai as well. So yeah, that's me. Let's get on with the video. The base I used for this figure was part of the bootleg 6-pack for S.H Figuarts. Obviously the articulation isn't all there because it was part of this bootleg 6-pack, so it's not an official S.H Figuarts, but it's labelled as an S.H Figuarts bootleg pack. So that's where the figure come from. There should be pictures. You can watch the review of the 6-pack I did a couple years back now. So I'll put a list of what you need to create him in the description, so you won't have to pause the video, you can see it in the description. But I will mention the tail. You'll have to figure out what you want to use for the tail. I'll go into this in further detail because I ended up using that. I'll explain what it is, but you will need something for the tail. So before you do anything, you want to dismantle it and wash it. You want to wash off all the factory press and all the oils that can be left on the plastic. Bootlegs can be quite bad, God knows what can be on it. And dismantle it. I had a part at the head, the face, the legs were off and the feet were off, and the rest, I mean the arms are attached to that body, so I left those on, and the wings were attached to the body, so I left those on as well. But I started on his head. I'll have pictures showing you all the way through, and I'll be using my official cell to show you. So with the head, it comes apart like the cell does with the face there, and I started with the back spikes, and it works the same as this one. So I peeled it from there with my fingers, and then peeled it off, and then I cut it from about there, and then I cut it right down the side, so it's obviously only left with the sides that are on Imperfect Cell. I can show you here, I've got some of the parts that I ended up cutting off of Imperfect Cell's head, so that gives you an idea of how much to cut off, and obviously you can see the pictures showing throughout. Once these parts are off, there's a huge gap in the back of the head, so I used Milliput, a 2-part epoxy putty, to fill in the gaps. This was all with my fingers to begin with, just to smooth over the gap in the head and make it rounded off with the rest of it before I started with any of the other sculpting. While you're filling in the head, you want to make sure that you go all the way around to have a layer of clay in there, to be able to use a knife to score in the detail lines with a sharp knife going across the head, as Imperfect Cell has on his design. Once I'd done that bit, I moved on to the spikes. So again, using Milliput epoxy putty, I mixed them together and started adding clay on. I wish with this one that his spikes were a bit further apart and a bit more kind of slanted going outwards, but I did that all with fingers to begin with my fingers, just to get the right shape and to get it to stick on there. I didn't use any sculpting tools or anything because it seemed quite fiddly, and I can always smooth it out later. So I did that part with my fingers to make his spikes, and then for this custom, it's been the first one I've done where I've had to use more sandpaper than anything for the sculpt. I mean, it looked like an absolute mess to begin with, but you can, using sandpaper, you can pretty much re-sculpt it with sandpaper alone. And that's what I ended up doing with this guy, because my original sculpt, I hadn't sculpted anything for a while, and it was quite lumpy and uneven. But I knew using sandpaper, which is a method, it's just another method of sculpting, but it does take a little bit longer but it doesn't matter. If you struggle to get your sculpt nice and smooth to begin with, you can always smooth it out with sandpaper once you've finished. After that, I moved on to the mouth part, as you can see he has. So to do that, I used a little bit of epoxy putty, and you can make the shape. What I did is kind of pressed it down onto using a cutting board, and you can make the shape with your fingers, the general shape of what you want that to be. And then using a glue stick like this, which I love this tool for something like this, you wouldn't realise how good it is. You can, after making the shape on the board, you can use it to scrape it up as gently as possible, get it into your fingers, and then layer it obviously against where you want it on the face. And you can use a sculpting tool with a bit of water. Water with the epoxy putty is always fantastic, and use that and press in around it and rub against it to actually stick the putty down onto his face. After it's down, again, use a sharp knife to create the line detail going across the mouth part, and then leave to dry. After that, I moved on to his feet, as you can see there. Little focus. And I almost kind of cheated or made a shortcut with this. The feet were quite rubbery on this bootleg, so I cut the toes from the original feet to make the shape of kind of Cell's 3 toes. I really wanted to sculpt them. It would have been a better shape, but this saved me time, and I was worried with cutting the feet halfway down and re-sculpting the toes. I was worried about the balance that would be left on the feet once I'd sculpted it. So you'll see the pictures. That's how I did, with a sharp knife, cut down through the feet to give the shape of his 3 toes. And then what I did, to make it look like the toes are actually kind of coming out from the feet, they're not just leading on from the top of the foot, there's now an actual layer there. I got some epoxy putty and roll it in your hand like that until I'm using tack as an example here so I don't get my hands covered in putty. Roll it into a small cylinder like that, and then I placed it over the toes, so it'll go over the feet like that. And then again, so you can make it that long, you don't have to worry about the excess, what's left on there. And then using the tool, again, press down until it's smoothed out. You can always smooth it out with sandpaper, but that's how to press the clay to get it stick to the figure. And that's how I got the line going across above the toes, so it looks like his toes are coming out of his feet instead of just leading on. Back to the head now. Obviously, when you're doing the clay to make the spikes, you can build the spikes out, but you want to make sure that you have the clay in the middle covering his forehead, because once that's dry, that's where you're going to want to put the kind of Cell's forehead diamond in. So I made the shape of that same way that I made the shape for the mouthpiece. You put it down on the surface, you can flatten it out, use your fingers or any kind of like sculpting tools or anything you want to create the shape, and then again the edge of this to gently scrape it up from the board and stick it on. Same again, use the same technique to stick it to the forehead, using one of those to kind of push down on the edges of the clay until it's flush with the rest of the forehead, and then leave to dry. Now to sculpt his kind of stomach and ribs, the orange part, I used the what I call my paper technique. I've showed it in my it was in my Yardrat Goku where I used that, and it's essentially using paper to get the right shape of the epoxy putty. So I'll have Cell here and say I've got cut out some paper there to measure. This is far too big for Perfect Cell, so you can see it's kind of like that, and you think if it's there, then I'll have to cut it off across there to make it flush with there. And that's exactly what I did. So obviously I had paper and I wanted to make sure it was the exact same shape as that, and then it would lead around. So with your bit of paper that's matching the right size, flatten out some clay on a board and lie your bit of paper over the clay. Use a sharp knife to cut out the exact shape of the bit of paper, and then back to that, you can use that to scrape it up, but you know, because you've cut it from that piece of paper, that it will be the correct size of putty that you will need to wrap around him. And once he's on, that again, press down on the edges to mould it all in to the figure and get it flush and to get the plastic to stick. The same technique with paper can be used to measure the bit in between his legs, because it leads right through to the back, as you can see there, without me trying to move them around too much. You can see it's orange back there. So use the clay, get the right shape, stick it on, and then using a sharp knife, once it's all on and you're happy with kind of the shape of it, use sharp knife to score the detail lines going across, and the lines you can see on the bit in between his legs as well. It's not 100% accurate because of how this custom works. The tail comes from essentially where a tailbone would be, where the actual Imperfect Cell's tail should come down from the back. So when I sculpted the front, I added more clay into the back. It's coming out a bit further to kind of almost make it look like it's where his tail was from. And when you're doing that with the clay on the front, to smooth over any kind of joint where the clay or where the putty joins the plastic, get your fingers wet or your thumbs wet, and you can rub it against, and you'll see as it starts to rub with your fingers, and it will smooth out over the surface, and you won't kind of see any joints. You can always, with sandpaper, once it's dry, smooth out the joints where the putty meets the plastic. So yeah, that's how to kind of get a nice smooth finish on a sculpt that you've just done. Once the stomach and back are dry, I made the shape of the chest diamond again on a flat surface. So you can mould the shape of it with your fingers, always using water, because it just helps you smooth over the clay. Works so much better when it's that smallest bit damp. And then scuff it up with that one, still keeping it as neat as possible, and stick to it. I used that once it was stuck on. You can use the end of that to push back up against the diamond to get your clay in a nice straight line going around, so it looks as neat as possible. Right, now moving on to the tail and how I went about that. I spent a couple days trying to figure out what I was going to use for the tail. It was a happy accident really, as you can see on this bootleg S.H Cell. He has a hole there for a screw and a hole in his tailbone for a screw, and I realised this is actually a Marvel Legends Build-A-Figure piece, I believe from Tiger Stripe Wolverine, and it turns out that those end bits there fit into the back of those screw holes perfectly. So I decided I was going to use that. You get two of them in the pack, so I've got this one left over. And what I did to sculpt it is on a chopping board, using a rolling pin or something, so you can flatten out the clay so it's nice and smooth. And then what I did is kind of, if you have the clay on a surface, I put that one over the clay like that, so the clay was underneath it, and then you'll be able to see in the pictures how I mean. So once it's around the clay, I used that to push up on each side, and as you push up, the clay, the putty, starts to fold over the tail, so then you've got some curvature to work with. And then once you've got it kind of going around, you can pick it up with the clay. And again, with joins where the clay meets other bits of clay or putty, sorry, and you can use water or your fingers or a tool to smooth down where that joint is, and you will not see it once you've smoothed over enough. So go all the way around the tail as I did. It was lumpy, as I said before, to begin with. The sculpt was quite lumpy. It was a little bit awkward to do, and but you can always fix that with sandpaper afterwards once it's dry. To make the stinger on the end of his tail, I rolled up like a cylinder shape of epoxy putty. It was about the same width as this handwriting pen, as you can see there, and so I cut that, and using your fingers you can twist and roll the end and twist it off and roll it up until it obviously makes the spike on the end, so it's all in one uniform piece. I just found this easier to do with my fingers, because you can feel, you can pull it, and then you can get the shape of the spike as you want it. And then I push down on top of the tail using my fingers to, if you go like that, get your fingers a bit damp and kind of push the clay on to the end of the tail. And I'll explain how to clean that up in a minute, but this is just how to get the actual stinger stuck to the end of the tail. You will see with the end of that there is a little bit where it gives you room to squeeze it down inside the cylinder of clay. Once I've done that, to clean it up, you can use one of those to push up against the clay and get it nice and straight going around the tail. So once that was dry, I then rolled up, see if this was putty, get a bit and you can roll it in your hand until it's nice, long and round. And then I rolled that around the end of the tail where it joins the stinger to give it like the look of it being the end and the extra kind of circle around it, so you can definitely see where the stinger ends and the tail begins. Once the sculpt is completely dry, you can move on to sanding him down, getting a nice smooth finish. And you want to use quite a rough sandpaper to begin with, get all the lines and everything smoothed out, the uneven surfaces nice and smooth. But rough sandpaper will leave tiny little scratches in all of the dry putty. So once you've used rough sandpaper and it's the shape you want it and the sculpt you want it, get fine grade sandpaper and go over the top of the sculpt with very fine grade sandpaper, and it will get rid of all the tiny scratches and give you a lovely smooth finish over the sculpt. Once I'd sanded down, there are a few things I had to do to kind of bring the lines back into the clay. And you can see it's there sculpted and the lines are quite neat. But if you sand down too much, you will start sanding into the detailed lines that you've sculpted when the putty was still wet. But what you can do is, what I do sometimes when I find it awkward, once it's dry, you can cut into it using a really sharp knife and then use the very edge of a piece of sandpaper to, and I'll show you exactly what I mean, to file it down, which I've done. This is a bit of clay here, putty, and you can see, I hope you can see that line going across the middle of it there. And what I did, so I think my hand was in the way, that's a much better look at that line going across. So I had a sharp knife make the cut down where you want the line to be, and then what I did with a little bit of sandpaper, you can then, where the cut is, file it down. Obviously it doesn't take as long as it looks, it's just this is quite fiddly because I've used such a small piece to do it. So you can cut into it, and then where it's cut, get edge of sandpaper and sand it into the cut, and you'll end up with a nice smooth line once the clay is already dry. When everything's smoothed out and you're happy with the texture of all the sculpt, you can move on to painting. But before you do, the sanding usually leaves quite a lot of dust, so with a damp cloth, just give your figure a quick wipe, make sure everything is off so it is smooth and clean before you start painting. What I did first is give it a base coat with white for the colours, because I wanted it to be quite vibrant over the top. But with the joints, so you paint it white all over, as you see, and as you see there, I've just folded down the elbow and there is no paint rub on the elbow, it's still green, as you can see. So when I painted it white, you then move the joints to see where the paint rub will rub off, and once you can see where it's rubbing off, get some sandpaper, you can get a tiny bit like that and fold it so you've got a corner. Like, you can do all sorts when you fold sandpaper with really fine edges, and where the paint's rubbing off, then sand into the joint, and you'll see it will sand in, and then you can once you've done that, you can repaint it, move the joint again. Once you've sanded it enough, it will not remove the paint. So I'll show you again. Fold his elbow up and then back down, no paint rub whatsoever. Right, now onto the paint, and I will admit the lighter green didn't come out. I know it's not really accurate, I wish it was a more kind of a brownish, yellowish kind of green. It was quite hard while mixing that colour because I didn't have an actual colour for that, I had to create it myself. So but for the green over the top, the darker green, I used a moot green colour. For the black, just a standard base black For the blue in his joints, I used a what's that, a Lothern blue colour. That's that one there. For the stinger, I used that Carrick stone. That's a perfect colour for the stinger. And for the orange, I used a Troll Slayer orange. And what I wanted to try for the diamonds, the bits on his forehead and his chest, in so many different pictures, you can't tell from Imperfect Cell. It's like sometimes, is it blue, is it black, is it purple, is it blue again? There's so many different pictures. So what I did, and it's always shiny, it's a shinier texture, so I found this, the technical soulstone blue, and it goes over the top of another colour. I do wish for that I had white underneath, because I think it would show the blue better off, but when there's a light shining against it, sometimes it looks black, sometimes it looks blue, and I just thought it was kind of a really good technical paint to kind of go with it, to give the effect that I wanted compared to the matte colour of the rest of the body. I also highly recommend Gundam Markers. That's what I used. They're like paint pens with a really fine nib on the end. That's what I used to do Cell's eyes and the line across his mouth. The line across his mouth is exactly why I didn't want to paint in all the lines and the detail going across him, because if that was all the same colour, you wouldn't be able to see where the mouth is. It would just look like the rest of it. So that was just a creative kind of decision I went with, so you could see that his mouth was there and that it wasn't the same coloured lines going all the way down. But Gundam Markers, they are really easy to use. You can find them on Amazon. They're so nice for getting the detail in. If you look at even the Cell's cat-like pupils, just two strokes of the Gundam Marker. I obviously I bought them to begin with for the line paneling on the Scout of Vegeta 2.0, because he didn't have any kind of lines or shading on him whatsoever. So that's what I bought them for, and they come in very handy for this custom. I'll say when you're painting the blue, or when you start painting him, do as much of the inside parts as possible when you start, so you can come over at the end and do the rest of the outside. You will still touch bits of the inside, blobs of green here and there. There's nothing wrong with having to repaint a couple times until you get it absolutely perfect. But if you start with the inside bits, it should give you less problems further into the painting. You'll want a fine detail brush, so you can see there, like for the hands and for the toes, a fine detail brush to put in the fingernails and toenails, and you can see the small lines again. That was the brown Gundam Marker that allows to give you that fine detail. I'm really glad with how the hands and the feet turned out. You can see the brown lines on the toes. That again is the Gundam Marker. They are fantastic pieces to use while painting a custom figure. When you're happy with the paint job and you've got it looking how you want, the kind of underneath lot, I will point out I had him pose with his leg too far up, and that little bit there is where it was stuck against there for too long. Like, it doesn't happen straight away, but I had him in that pose for like 2 days, and it ended up sticking to that bit there. So that blue part on his right leg obviously come after the paint job, but once I was happy with it, I used a fine paintbrush to add all the black spots. I did that manually, every single one, with a paintbrush using the black paint, and on the back as well. But it looks really neat. I was quite pleased with how it ended up turning out. Trying to watch videos and look at pictures on where they actually are, whether there's any on the backs of his legs or the sides, and on his face as well, tiny little spots. So it wants to be a tiny little paintbrush that you're going to use. If you use a big splodgy thing, obviously it will turn out looking awful, because you want to get them nice and neat so it looks as authentic as possible. Okay, so now you finally put all the detail into the figure and you finished all the paint and everything. You can now seal the paint job. What I use is a matte finish kind of substance. It's called Mod Podge, and I mix it with water, so it's quite diluted, as you should be doing with your paints, because when you paint it and you don't dilute water, you get quite thick blobs. You want to thin it out, and it just gives you a nicer, smoother finish. As you can see, this is all quite smooth going across. You can't really tell there's any splodgy bits of paint there. So if you dilute your paints and dilute your sealer as well, well, only if you're using Mod Podge. There's other sealants that you probably won't need to dilute, but with Mod Podge it's easier. So you get it quite watery, almost milky, and then use a paintbrush to just cover the figure all over, really, just to finish it off. It obviously dries see-through, so you don't have to worry about it adding colour or doing anything to the paint. It's completely clear once it dries, but it will protect your paint job, and it also gives it that kind of finish where it doesn't look like paint. It looks like it's gone back to plastic again, which makes it look like more of a real figure and less like a custom. So I actually really like that Mod Podge because of the finish that it gives onto the figure, as well as sealing the paint. I think that is pretty much everything. I hope I haven't missed out anything. Feel free to ask me any questions if you're not sure. If you want to do this yourself, definitely hit me up. Like and subscribe and all the usual stuff. Follow my Instagram. If you did follow my Instagram, you'll probably see this in process and how bad it actually looked when I first started it. The sculpt was pretty awful, and I didn't actually think it would have come out looking this good. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. As I said, like and subscribe, all the usual stuff, and I hope you have a good day.